Well, welcome everyone, and I want to thank you for your presence this morning. It's a pleasure to be with all of you as we gather to reflect on the life of Father John Courtney Murray of the Society of Jesus and the significance of his contributions today, 50 years after his death. And this day would not have been possible without the efforts of a number of members of our community. And so before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank those who helped us in this convening today. First, John Borelli, who leads our efforts in our office on issues related to Catholic identity and dialogue, and Sam Wagner, who together led the organization of this conference. Our Vice President for Global Engagement, Tom Banchoff, the Director of our Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life, John Carr. Father Leon Hooper, who directs our Woodstock Theological Center library, and who maintains an online archive of Father Murray's papers. Father Leo Lefebvre, the Matteo Ricci Chair and Professor of Theology here at Georgetown. And we're deeply grateful for the support and collaboration of our Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, led by Sean Casey. He, along with his colleagues who serve as senior fellows at the Berkley Center, provided invaluable support to this conference. Father David Hollenbach, our Pedro Rupe Distinguished Research Professor in the School of Foreign Service, Father Drew Christensen, Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Global Human Development in the School of Foreign Service, and Gerard Mannion, the Joseph and Winifred Amaturo Chair in Catholic Studies in our Department of Theology. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't extend our sincere appreciation, although I hate to expose you this way, Brian, but because my colleagues may not have known that a conversation with you was really the inspiration for this conference. They may want to thank you in their own way. But that being said, if I've had a good idea in the last several years that I've served in this role, generally those good ideas came from Brian. And so I'm grateful to you, Brian, for the inspiration for this idea. All of you here are responsible for putting together a rich set of conversations that look at the contributions of John Courtney Murray, his ideas of religious liberty and public theology through the lens of our current historical moment. And I want to thank you all for your efforts. During the 1960s, as we sought to more deeply understand the public role of Catholic higher education in the United States, John Courtney Murray visited our community on a number of occasions. At a pivotal moment during the Second Vatican Council, he delivered a lecture to our community on what he viewed as the key accomplishments of the Council so far and the work ahead, especially with regard to religious liberty. This work ultimately resulted in the Council's document on religious liberty, which he helped to draft. When he closed his lecture here, he urged that the accomplishments of the Council were of little value unless they were implemented. And this task continues for us today and remains a commitment of our community. Over the course of our time today, we'll hear from a range of experts and leaders on the different aspects of John Courtney Murray's life and his continuing influence and impact 50 years after his death. And I wish to express my gratitude to our speakers and participants for your presence here today. It is good for us, for those who have gathered today, to have this time for reflection at this moment in the life of our nation, life of our church. And I thank you all again for joining us. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Father Leon Hooper to begin our panel conversation on John Courtney Murray, Jesuit, Churchman, and public theologian. Leon?
Hello, I'm Leon Hooper, and I've got three tasks to briefly do right now. One, to introduce myself, and then to introduce our session a little bit, and then our two speakers. I am a California Jesuit, but I've lived in these parts for about 30 years. I worked for a while at Woodstock Theological Center, and then, as you heard, I am now director of the Woodstock Theological Center Library. During that time, we managed to get some Lilly grants, and we ended up in 4 publications on Murray. My own work of Dissertation Transformed, which is the ethics of discourse, then 2 collections of Murray primary sources, Religious Liberty, Catholic Struggles with Pluralism, and Bridging the Sacred and Secular. And then from a conference that several of you were actually involved in, resulting in a volume, John Courtney Murray and the Growth of Tradition, that I did with Todd Whitmore. My own area is not very specific issues in Murray studies, which this conference seems to be focusing on, nor on Murray's systematic Trinitarian theology, but rather on the interface and the interaction between social ethics and Trinitarian theology. The problem of God, as it corrects and is corrected by the problem of religious freedom. Incidentally, 2 titles of 2 important works in the latter part of Murray's life. So that's me, and how about our session? I'll begin with just a little bit of a story. In the spring of 1972 at Boston College, I was searching for a dissertation topic after having been forced by a Protestant to read Murray, the later Murray, Beyond We Hold These Truths. I came across in Murray's late publication some very Bernard Lonergan type phrases. Rather excitedly, I then got me up over to the Jesuit recreation room at drink time, plunked myself down next to Bernard Lonergan, and started to quiz him on his dealing with John Courtney Murray. Bernie did not like to be quizzed all that much, but he was for a time gracious. He talked some of John's running the CDSA discussion on the possible impact that Lonergan's insight might have on systematic theology. And he described talking with John about an early Lonergan draft of a paper on historicity and historical consciousness. Bingo, a dissertation topic. But then I apparently pushed Bernie too far. Abruptly, he stood up and impatiently declared that, of course, John was catching on to historical consciousness. He was, after all, a bright man. And then he invited me, Bernie invited me to dinner, and we went out and saw a very crummy spaghetti Western movie. For that day, at least, we did not talk more about Murray's brightness. All of us here would agree probably that Murray was a very bright man, though we might differ on which of his qualities and assertions were JCM at his best and those that were JCM at something less than best. And throughout this day, we will appeal to his brightness and some of his dimness as well, but bringing in our own brightness and dimness as we discuss what today troubles us, but also strengthens us in our various societies, in our church and our world. The first session that we are setting up the social benchmarks for our later considerations. The 2 societies within which Murray was most involved were, of course, the Roman Catholic Church on the one hand, and American civil, primarily academic society on the other. Murray was committed to the proposition that at least 2 there are, religious society and civil society, in which we know our God and God's will for us as a people. Jerry Fogarty will focus on the arguments within religious society, that is the church, especially concerning the issue of religious liberty. Francesca Cadadu will describe his dealings in the American, that is mostly academic society. Jerry is often blamed for the fact that we religious are no longer tax exempt when we go to secular institutions. He does, however, have a few other accomplishments under his belt. His CV runs for about 14 pages, including 7 books and another in the hopper, over 100 articles, various popular press articles. It includes interesting committees, such as one of 3 Vatican appointees to a Vatican Jewish committee over the Vatican and World War II. Most of this was accomplished while working at the University of Virginia, where he was taxed, with stops at Fordham, BC, and CU, where presumably he wasn't. Today, he will tell us something about the church where internal arguments concerning religious freedom took place. Jerry.
I'm hobbling around not because of the case Fogarty versus U.S., but my misspent youth of playing racquetball 4 days a week for over 25 years meant I had to have a knee replacement recently. So it's a matter of supposed to go up and down stairs and do all those other stuff, and I admit I'm not. I met John Courtney Murray only once, and that was when I had some brown hair and was still a scholastic. But then I was doing my dissertation, starting it here at Georgetown, when I realized my dissertation was on Americanism, which was a forerunner of the church-state issue of religious liberty and so forth, and that notion of thesis hypothesis, about which I will say something more, came up for one of the first times. And I had just drafted a letter to John Courtney Murray and came down for a beer that night when somebody came in to say that John had died. He had died in a New York City taxi cab, and other people remarked, if any of us died in New York, we died on a subway. John did everything in a big way. So without further adu, and since Leon has already told you about my stirs with the government, which means that they watch me carefully, anyway, I want to divide this into 3 major areas. First of all, Americanism at the end of the 19th century, about which John knew nothing until he was recuperating from a heart attack after he'd been teaching at Yale. Yale will do that to people. And then I want to talk about the rediscovery of the tradition and how it gets misunderstood. And finally, I want to deal briefly with the council itself. Well, first of all, there was a long-standing tradition of support for religious liberty beginning in colonial Maryland, where just the Jesuits who came to colonial Maryland did not come as priests. They came as settlers like any other lay people. Therefore, they took up property like any other lay group. Therefore, they were exempt from all sorts of things. But they demanded not to sit in the assembly because that also acted as a law court, giving out capital punishment. So anyway, right from the beginning of Maryland, there was this, the church and state were separate, and I'll come back to why I'm stressing that. Then you had a pastoral letter in 1837 in which they defended this whole notion of church and state separation, the bishops, that is. Then you had the 1864 Syllabus of Errors, with Article 55, which is one of the most misinterpreted, misunderstood documents even up to now. I had a very prominent priest tell me that I was wrong in saying Vatican II did not change any doctrine because it was a defined doctrine there should be a union of church and state. Common misunderstanding and untrue. Now, what was condemned was that it is necessary for the church to be separated from the state and the state from the church. I'll come back to why I'm using it. That was the real interpretation, the authentic one. The Archbishop of Baltimore at the time, Martin Spalding, issued a pastoral letter which he sent to every Catholic elected office holder and Roman officials. And though he got a response, he never got any type of clarification. So therefore, his defense of the American system in the light of the syllabus was still deemed acceptable in 1864. Then you had in 1886, the second cardinal appointed, James Gibbons of Baltimore, which included this area, by the way, at that time. And in there was a report from the secretary to the nunciature of Austria, named Straniero, and he wrote back this elaborate report to Rome about here was truly a free church and a free state. Now this is the Vatican representative bringing the red beretta to Cardinal Gibbons. And in there he said, because here the church was born separate from the state, and such it has remained. Whereas in a manner of speaking, in Europe, both church and state have been born from the ruins of paganism. He recognized that the United States was different, and this is going to be important. And obviously somebody did a job on him for that. And then a few months later, Gibbons went to Rome to get his red hat, and he gave a talk in his new church of Santa Maria in Trastevere praising American religious liberty. Cardinal Keeler, later on, by the way, about 10 years ago, put a plaque in that church commemorating that event. As you go in, it's all the way on the left, up towards the front, and there's a plaque that faces the altar. By the way, if you look closely at the coat of arms, the Cardinal Duke of York was also the titular pastor of that church. You know, he was the last legitimate king in England, you know, this last of the Stuart line. I'm sure everybody remembers that. Now, one of the things that was happening in Rome in the late 1880s was a general fear of republics. And one of the things was most republics were founded, they were anti-clerical. I try to point out to a theologian friend of mine that the greatest fear of the popes during the 19th century was pretty much Freemasonry. And he said, well, I wouldn't have thought of that. It was behind every revolution. And we had outbreaks of it here too. In general, there was a Roman fear of republics because who is in charge? You know, they're used to dealing with kings and so forth. The only time they spoke favorably in favor of a republic was in 1892 when they turned to Republican France to get their assistance in ending the Roman question, which did not end until 1929. And at that time, they said, if a republic works for the United States, it should work for France too. Well, this had a political motive behind it. It was not support of Republican government so much as pragmatically trying to end this situation. The Roman question, for those of you not up on this, is from 1870 when the forces of the Kingdom of Italy occupied the city of Rome until 1929, the Pope lived inside the Vatican as a prisoner, self-imposed. But nevertheless, it meant that for all that time, he never once set foot in his own cathedral, St. John Lateran, across the city. Then in the midst of this, there was a symposium held in Fribourg in Switzerland. A number of other questions had come up at the time, but the big one I'm going to focus on is a speech by Dennis O'Connell, who was then a Monsignor, in which he takes what had been an explanation of the syllabus of errors back in 1864 to 66, where it said what is being condemned is a thesis, always and everywhere the church should be separated from the state and the state from the church. By the time Dennis O'Connell gave his talk, he talked about the real Catholic thesis is there should be a union of church and state. And the hypothesis is whatever is satisfactory while working for that union. That was the standard misunderstanding of this statement. Now, Dennis O'Connell, I don't know why he did it, because earlier he had been a proponent of the religious liberty as we understand it. But the thing is, there were a lot of other questions that came up at this same conference. One was the beginning of historical criticism. It was where Lagrange, Marie-Joseph Lagrange, gave his first talk on the sources of the Pentateuch. Also, the question of evolution had started to arise. That was going to be with the church right through the 1950s and 60s. So ultimately, what was condemned in Americanism was not this church-state thing, but nevertheless a statement that by and large, the American system is not the ideal, but nobody, including Murray, would claim that. And one of the difficulties was, if you go back and read the Catholic Encyclopedia, I have to instruct my students, nothing exists unless it's online. So I keep telling them that they must look at the New Catholic Encyclopedia, which is in book form, it's in the library. But instead, they'll tell me, well, you know, you talked about Americanism, there's not even an article on that. I said, did you go online or did you go to the library? Because if you go to volume 1 of the Catholic Encyclopedia, under Americanism, it says, Si testem benevolentiae, which was the letter condemning Americanism. Now, it did not touch the issue of church and state, by the way, when Americanism was condemned, but it rather talks about, they really thought the American church was Pelagian. So they cited the Second Council of Orange, which most bishops wouldn't know about, probably, at that time. Anyway, in the syllabus, in the article on the syllabus of errors written by a Jesuit canonist, he said the real Catholic position is it is not necessary that the church be separated from the state and the state from the church. That was apparently not read. Murray certainly didn't know about it. It's one of the defects. But we'll come back to that, because this was the problem that got Murray in trouble, was trying to argue that it really wasn't necessary for the church to be united with the state. Well, a rediscovery of this understanding. In 1920, the great Monsignor John Ryan wrote an address in which he talked about Catholic thesis is there should be a union of church and state wherever Catholics are in the majority. And I said, but you shouldn't worry about this because it may occur in 4,000 years where Catholics are in the majority. So he sort of brushed it off. In 1928, in the midst of the Al Smith campaign, however, the current history part, which was then owned, it's still a journal, but it was owned at that time by the New York Times, they asked for Brian to do an article in answer to a Baptist minister named Fountain. This time, he went back to the original meaning of syllabus in the Catholic Encyclopedia written by Father Haag, H-A-A-G. And one of the things is, he explains in great detail, that the true Catholic position is it is not necessary church be separated from the state and the state from the church. Okay, then we come to Murray. Murray apparently never heard this. At least I couldn't find it out, subject to correction from somebody who's maybe done more work on this. But one of the things that Murray was addressing originally was he called for a religious conspiracy. He had a way with words. Conspiracy, breathing together. A religious conspiracy of Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and even secularists for the sake of the common good. And then he got caught in the attack with the thesis hypothesis as currently understood. That is that there should be a union of the Catholic Church and the state wherever Catholics are in the majority. He received attacks from Monsignor Joseph Fenton and Father Francis Connell at the Catholic University of America. They were locked into a type of theology created really in the 20th century. That's the way I love even the contemporary church. We've always done it this way. Yeah, for the last 50 years, short time. Now, what happened with Murray, though, is he then got attacked. Joseph Komanchek, now retired from the Catholic University, has an article on this, that it was Connell and Fenton writing to Rome. Fenton was a close friend of Alfredo Ottaviani, who became a cardinal in 1953 and then began attacking Murray. He gave an address in which he talked about the true treatment, understanding of church and state, is there should be a union of the Catholic Church and the state wherever Catholics are in the majority because error has no rights. Now, I keep telling people I've never seen an error. I've seen people in error, but if you find an error, bring it to my office. And one of the difficulties is that this was thought to be the authentic Catholic teaching. And then he went on and added to his speech that this is contrary to some developments in the United States where certain theologians are denying this as true doctrine. Guess what? The Osservatore Romano reported that he spoke. Didn't say what he said. The entire text of that article was never published, especially the part about the United States. It finally was published in the magazine edited by Joseph Fenton, the American Ecclesiastical Review, but left out the part about what was happening in America. Obviously, somebody had authority and power. And here's my conjecture. The same year, that was 1953, that speech occurred, same year in this fall, they were dedicating the new American College. And Cardinal Stritch of Chicago, a member of the magisterium, Alfredo was a cardinal, but he was not a bishop. He did not become a bishop until 1962. Most curial cardinals were not bishops at that time. Later on, they became bishops. So Stritch gave a talk or a toast to American liberty, and he got worried about maybe he was stepping on toes. And then he was told by a Monsignor who was sitting at the table, oh no, that is merely Ottaviani's personal opinion. It has the weight that he's a distinguished theologian, but it is not church doctrine. That Monsignor was Giovanni Battista Montini, later Paul VI. So therefore, in higher circles, there was disagreement, but that didn't trickle down. Now, one of the things is Murray finally undertook silence in 1954. Soon thereafter, and I have to mention here the role of the apostolic delegate, Egidio Vagnozzi. The previous delegate, Ciccognani, had been in office for 25 years, but he stayed out of internal affairs of the bishops. He had a much different approach. Vagnozzi did everything to get rid of Murray, and then he turned on biblical scholarship. That's why I mentioned the parallel with what happened in Americanism. Same issues were coming up. And if you go back to Humani Generis, by the way, they also bring up evolution. So that fit in with the triumvirate of issues that we're seeing. And one of the things Murray had to show was with the end of the 30 Years' War, you did have the notion cuius regio eius religio, that the ruler chooses the religion. But now he's talking about pluralism of religion within a country, and this was the new development. Now, when Vatican II was called, Murray was left at home, to use this term, disinvited by Cardinal Vagnozzi, by Archbishop Vagnozzi, and by Ottaviani. The second session, he was made a peritus, an expert of the council, because the politics that gets involved. Of course, the church has never been political. And in this case, it was the influence of Cardinal Spellman, who hated Vagnozzi. It wasn't so much that he was sympathetic with what was going on with Murray as it was that he couldn't stand Vagnozzi. By the way, Spellman also defended biblical scholars. I don't think he understood them, but that's beside the point. The president incumbent of New York had asked me to think of doing a biography of him. I'd still be interested. Now, one of the things that changed the attitude was John the 23rd's intervention in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Supposedly with the knowledge of the White House, but they denied that they had any knowledge of it. He went on radio speaking in French, a recognized diplomatic language, not in Italian. And he said, men of goodwill should be able to settle their differences by appeal to an international body. Well, there's only one international body, and everybody knew what he was talking about, but he still spoke in Vaticanese, the men of goodwill, but it didn't say who they were. So then when the missile crisis was settled, he then issued Pacem in Terris that had two major points. One is it was addressed to prelates, so forth and so on, and to all men of goodwill, that same phrase. And then he went on to talk about new forms of government where the emergence of the constitutional republic, with the people still preserving their rights but surrendering them to the government. British and American common law, in other words, which was foreign to the European mentality. Now, in the council itself, the original part on religious liberty was chapter 5 of the Declaration on Ecumenism. First three chapters had to do with inter-Christian relations. Chapter 4 became Nostra Aetate, which dealt with non-Christians. And then finally, you had chapter 5, religious liberty. The trouble was that originally it was too tied in with the notion of the separation of church and state, was the pragmatic means by which religious liberty was brought about in countries like the United States. And the American bishops had to learn, too, that you could have the complete union of church and state in some countries, but complete religious liberty. Great Britain. The Queen is still head of church, but everybody has religious liberty. But only recently, within the last 150 years. Now, the development of the idea here was to get into that notion of pluralism within a country, not just pluralism between countries, cuius regio eius religio, but rather the whole notion of why is the human person to be subject of religious liberty? That idea ultimately came from the work in biblical scholarship. And Dei Verbum talks about what is revelation ultimately? The person of Jesus Christ. It's not a book, it's not a manuscript, it's a person. The dignity of the human person is to be able to respond to the Word of God, the incarnate Word. And the evidence for this is that the final draft of Dignitatis Humanae Personae, notice the title, on the dignity of the human person. Murray was in the hospital with a heart attack. He had several heart attacks, by the way, even in his 40s. So like one of my mentors, he enjoyed poor health. And one of the things was Père Benoit and Congar helped draft the final version of the Declaration of Religious Liberty. Benoit had done the final version of Dei Verbum. And if you look at the scriptural basis for the dignity of the person, it's from the Epistle to the Ephesians. And what's used in the declaration of what is ultimately revelation, but the person of Jesus Christ in Dei Verbum, it's only 2 verses away from what's used also for the dignity of the human person as a subject of religious liberty. So I tried in this brief talk to put Murray within a context of a development of doctrine, a development that among religious liberty was one of several issues cut off during the 1850s and 60s. Wasn't the only one. And I would argue the Vatican II picked up these themes. So the people who are yelling that this is all new and so forth, no, they don't know much church history. And one of the things is, I think that part of our division today also stems from an inability to recognize What is the true dignity of the human person? Are we listening to a particular force within a nation, or are we listening to the incarnate Word of God? Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry.
Okay.
Jerry tells us that he met Murray once, but missed by a month studying with Murray. I myself missed meeting Murray by a decade. Francesca missed meeting him by much more than a single decade. Francesca works for the Foundation for Religious Science in Bologna, Italy, and is a visiting fellow at the Faith and Civil Society Unit at Goldsmiths, University of London. She holds a master's degree in international relations and a PhD in political doctrines from the University of Bologna. Her doctoral dissertation was on democracy and Catholicism in the United States, religious freedom and the political thought of John Courtney Murray, 1945 through 1860. Much of her research, a good deal of which was pursued in the Woodstock Library, has focused on Murray and the United States, but she is also coordinator of a project on religious literacy in Europe, and serves as interim secretary for the newly born European Academy of Religion. Francesca will focus us particularly on Murray, who faced into and found himself needing to argue, and there are quotations around that, with explicitly religious, pluralistic, and secular America. Francesca.
So let me first thank Georgetown University for organizing this conference and all the people who work for making my participation possible today. I am very honored to be here. When I started working on John Courtney Murray, I could not imagine that one day I would sit at the same table as Gerald Fogarty and Leon Hooper and all the eminent scholars who will follow us during the day, so thank you indeed. John Courtney Murray has been extensively studied by many of the people sitting in this room and other scholars, mostly Americans, who aimed to explain who he was and why his work and thought are still so important for the history of American Catholics and for the United States today. The risk which underlies any attempt to place past figures in present times is that of de-historicizing the subject, leading to the result of forcibly adapting his or her own ideas to the present. But I believe that locating John Courtney Murray in his own historical context is precious to our current debate because it offers guidance and inspiration that go beyond any interpretation. Unfortunately, in recent times, the number of both archival research and historical publications on Murray has sensibly decreased. The most recent archival discovery was the Memorandum on Church and State, which was delivered by Murray to Ambassador Claire Both-Luce in 1950 and found by Joe Komonchak. It opened new perspectives on the influence of Murray's thought on Pope Paul VI's standpoint regarding religious freedom, and Gerald Fogarty just mentioned it. After this discovery, I tried to contribute to the research with an article entitled A Call to Action, John Courtney Murray, S.J., and the Renewal of American Democracy, which was published in the Catholic Historical Review and is the point of departure of my contribution today. The latest volume concerning Murray is Struggle, Condemnation, and Vindication by Barry Hurdock, which was published in 2015. But I believe that a well-documented biography has yet to come. Of course, once the secret Vatican archives make the documents relating to the period of Pius XII papacy available, scholars will have access to those concerning the censorship, the silencing, imposed on Murray by the Holy Office in 1954 and again strongly in 1958. But I believe that a collection of Murray's works, both published and unpublished, would also be an important critical source of information. Anyway, I think that the real question is not about the sources, but about the subject. Do we believe that John Courtney Murray still has something to say? Do we still need to study his works? And if so, to what extent? In order to find the answers, we can start with another question. Who was John Courtney Murray? And the title of this first session is clear. He was a Jesuit, and no one could doubt it. Who else would ever challenge the Roman Curia? He was a churchman, devoted to his vows. Silencing him caused him pain in both body and soul. Finally, he was an American public theologian. He was a Catholic and an American intellectual. We hold these truths, which was published in 1960, is in fact specifically about the role played by the Catholic intellectual tradition in the articulation of a public philosophy capable of renewing American democracy. Today, I will start with a brief look at Murray's identity, then bring us through his general approach to intellectual life, and finally look at his practice of the role of the intellectual. He established his role as a public theologian precisely when American Catholicism was on the verge of turning the social, economic, and cultural power acquired during the 30s into an expression of an intellectual elite. The cultural movement that emerged from this context soon became part of the mainstream religious and secular intellectual environment, and Murray was part of it. He was no longer the Catholic in a ghetto and was very passionate about reaching out to non-Catholic circles and debates. He did not debate about all the issues of his time, but the number of topics he was able to discuss about was wide. Natural law, interfaith dialogue, the First Amendment, authority, democracy, national defense, public consensus, and religious freedom are among them. He was unconsciously part of the group labeled the Believing Skeptics, who shared a perception of their time as a moment of crisis, a moral vacuum created by the events of the decade that they just left behind, marked by Nazism, fascism, and the war. They thought that it was not only possible, but also necessary to re-establish a source for consensus to overcome the crisis, in order to renew the balance of the motto E pluribus unum. Public philosophy and public theology were a tool that could be employed against any despotic deviance from democracy in the search for a definition of an antidote to uncertainty. Both Protestant and Catholic churches in America were struggling to find a path to an historical narrative, less grounded in conflict. So Murray adapted the national historical narrative to the exigencies of his religious and national community. He undertook the task of understanding the meaning of public consensus in US history as a way to fill the moral vacuum created by, in his view, on the one hand, the loss of the dominant guidance by the Protestants, and on the other, the hesitation of the Catholic community in taking the leadership on such issues. In Murray's view, the truths held by the Americans were perfect fitting antidote, and Catholicism could actively contribute to their renewal through the principles and the traditions of natural law. What did Murray mean by natural law? We all know how ambiguous its definition may be. Murray defines it very generally as, quote, the philosophia perennis, whose origins go back to Heraclitus and to the greatest of Greek philosophers and Roman jurists, and whose developed expression is found in St. Thomas Aquinas and the later scholastics, end of quote. According to his work, the US public philosophy of the 18th century was derived from the tradition of natural law, the source of the ideas of justice, freedom, human law, and divine law, and of the limitation of state. But looking at the post-war United States, he found that the public philosophy had been eroded, eclipsed, discarded. The very idea of a public philosophy was alien. It was regarded with incomprehension and even with fear. Natural law was a key point in the dialogue between Catholics and Protestants. It offered an exit strategy from the theological consensus, which at the time was rejected by the Catholic Church and considered unfeasible by Murray himself. He appealed to the doctrine of natural law as, quote, a point of contact between two communities which stand in a relation of mutual suspicion to each other and yet share enough of a common heritage to offer a basis for overcoming that suspicion. Therefore, the great experiment of the American constitutional commonwealth was not intelligible and could not be made to work except by those men who possessed, quote, the public philosophy within whose context it was conceived. Those men were Catholics because he knew that this was our philosophy, our tradition. Murray believed that Catholics could be a creative minority and that through the renewal of the principles of the natural law preserved by Catholics, Americans could renovate the ancient bond that led them to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He explains this specific role in one of his articles. It was published in 1955. He took Arnold Toynbee's definition of the creative minority and easily adapted it to American Catholics. He believed that the Catholic system of education and the Christian family could contribute to the maintenance of a strong, traditional, religious, and moral commitment, while ensuring the stability of the Catholic and American society as a whole, because, quote, a creative minority's mission is to perform its work of creation, not just for itself, but for the benefit of the whole of the society to which it belongs, end of quote. But who could specifically understand the crisis, investigate, renovate, communicate the American truths, and finally enforce them? His answer was the intellectuals. And in order to mobilize the intellectuals of his time, he worked on the two sides of his identity, as a Catholic and as an American. So we go on the Catholic side. Patrick Hayes documented well the work that Murray did within the Catholic Commission on Intellectual and Cultural Affairs, hereafter CCICA, founded in 1946 at the Catholic University of America. According to Hayes' reconstruction, Murray worked devotedly on the launching of the CCICA. He was chairman of the membership committee and a leading figure in one of the most delicate phases, namely when the church-state studies were hastily concluded, mainly as a consequence of the remonstration expressed in 1952 by Cardinal Francis Spellman, who was a major financial contributor to the commission. But what is interesting here is its aim. The CCICA was meant to be a, quote, coalition of intellectuals who aimed to change the attitude towards the church and scholarship, and to aid in rebuilding the church and the world after World War II by cultivating an informed Catholic mind to perform, in the words of Murray, a ministry of clarifying, end of quote. Its constitution included a clear statement on its goals. First, to provide an organization through which Catholic scholars could be brought into a closer unity and contribute to a just and peaceful world order. Second, to draw together Catholic educational, scientific, and cultural activities without replacing them, and to enlist and utilize the abilities of Catholic scholars, especially among the laity. Third, to foster Catholic intellectual and cultural cooperation at home, and to establish and maintain relations with organized and individual Catholic scholars throughout the world. As we can see, the wording is quite similar to the one used by George Schuster in 1925, when it seemed that there were no scholars among Catholics, and John Tracy Ellis in 1955, 30 years later, when he called for a far more strategic step. But we had to wait for Ellis in order to see both the CCICA and its goals debated and assumed by the larger academic and church community. And Murray, among its ranks, took an even more proactive line. The Catholic scholar must face the challenge of avoiding the divorce of religion from the reason of man, and enforce the presence of Catholic doctrine and the philosophy it has inspired that were still conspicuously absent from the university. It was a call for a sounder intellectual apostolate. So I mentioned the Catholic side, we go on the American side. During the same years, Murray participated in the activities of the Center for the Study of the Democratic Institutions, which was based in Santa Barbara. Hereafter, I will mention it's CSDI. The CSDI was a think tank established by Robert Minor Hutchins, former president of the University of Chicago, for the Fund for the Republic of the Ford Foundation in 1952. Its initial objective was, quote, to assist the promotion of a natural security based on freedom and justice. But it later enlarged its objectives to furnish a more comprehensive understanding of the whole theory and practice of civil liberties. Hutchins and his fellow men believed that American society needed coherence and perspective, and that the fund, as the only educational foundation specifically dedicated to strengthening, quote, the basic fabric of the nation, could make an outstanding contribution to America and the world by correcting its moral vacuum, end of quote. We should not forget that they were directly experiencing the McCarthy era, so they felt compelled to stand up for rights and freedoms in an effort to strengthen the United States in its domestic and foreign activities. Moreover, the witch hunt contributed to the spread of the idea that being an Americanist meant being anti-communist and consequently anti-intellectual. As Richard Off's father has clearly demonstrated in Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, the anti-communist crusade of the late 40s had among its side effects the diffusion of resentment against intellectuals and intellectualism, especially among right-wing critics and politicians. So basically, intellectuals were generally considered to be sympathizers of communism. Murray's papers testify to his involvement in the formulation of the philosophy underlying the new center. One of his letters focuses closely on the Hutchins proposal and attempts to define, quote, the argument leading to the need of an intellectual center and its purpose. Intellectuals needed to communicate first the essence of US democracy with a more coherent, intelligible, and effective strategy. And second, the understanding of the American Republic as a constitutional commonwealth and as a pluralist society. The spirit was to guide the reformulation, the spirit that was to guide this reformulation was historical consciousness. And the method was argument. Theoretical agreement was not possible, but theoretical argument ought to be possible. According to the documents that are held by the University of Santa Barbara, Murray contributed to a variety of debates, mostly about the meaning of consensus, capitalism, economic development, and just war. One of the basic issues that the center analyzed from the beginning of its activities was religion and democracy, which later became the program of Religion in a Free Society. And Murray and Reynold Niebuhr, at that time vice president of the Theological Union Seminary, were the special consultants to it. Unfortunately, Murray could not remain involved in it for more than 2 years, due both to his health conditions and to his silencing. And John Courtney, who was staff assistant, basically took his place. Nonetheless, his contribution to the establishment of this specific program is worth a long analysis, which I try to summarize here through its premises and results. The project was designed to assist the Central Committee in its efforts to clarify basic issues. I believe that in order to understand what their profound questions were, it is useful to quote from the first document ever issued by the committee in January 1957, at a time when Niebuhr was not yet officially part of it. So it's probably Murray's text, but we don't know for sure. Quote, what is to be said for the oft-repeated position that only a Christian, or at least a God-fearing nation, can remain free? If general religious belief is essential to the preservation of freedom, what limits, if any, are to be placed, either by law or custom, on the promulgation and propagation of atheism and unbelief? As a matter of fact, what restrictions are actually placed on the unbeliever today? Is he free to speak where and when and how he chooses? Should he be? End of quote. So their aim was to get to the core of American religious identity within the context of the Cold War, investigating the absoluteness of the so-called war separation, the doctrinal position of the various churches on separation, and the conflict found in the citizen who was a believer and the believer who was a citizen. Murray and Niebuhr did not agree on most topics, specifically not on Murray's position on the role of natural law in society. But they certainly agreed on the fact that there was no need to search for a definitive solution to the church-state problem, and that the only real contribution that the group of experts could offer was a contextualized solution to each of the cases and areas where the interests of church and state seemed to clash. The election of 1960 was approaching, and the emergence of John Fitzgerald Kennedy as a Catholic candidate to the White House, already raised suspicions, if not fears. In August 1957, the Christian Century published an article entitled "Divide On for Catholic Vice President." The editors commented on a previous article published by Time magazine, which was entitled "Can a Catholic Win?" and stating that a Catholic could not even be nominated for a public post, such as the Vice President of the United States. The reason was, quote, "None of those suggested has demonstrated sufficient independence so that it can be trusted to stand against the never-ceasing drive of the Roman Catholic Church for access to public funds, as seen in the McCormack bid, and for preferential treatment by public figures and bodies. The Roman Church is not reconciled to those aspects of the Constitution of the United States, and in particular of the First Amendment, which keep church and state separate, make illegal the use of tax money for the support of religious establishments, and insist that all churches shall stand on equal footing in their relations with the state." End of quote. I believe that this quotation reflects well the general national hostility towards Catholics, at least until Kennedy's Houston speech. But we know that World War II had already opened the eyes of many Americans to the plurality of groups which composed their society. Blacks, women, Jews, and Catholics were in the spotlight. That does not mean that their rights and freedoms were implemented, but they acquired a clearer subjectivity. Were American civil and religious freedom enough for such a modern pluralistic society? Law, customs, and accommodation were identified by the Religion and Democracy Committee as the provisions on which rights were based. Therefore, the group of experts undertook the task of looking at these three aspects, law, customs, and accommodation, in cases such as the use of public funds to support church-directed education, the matter of double taxation, question of prayers, release time, and religious celebrations in public schools. CSDI was not just a Platonic academy, it was a true policy-driven think tank. It was Murray's and Niebuhr's wish that their committee would deal, according to such a devotion to argument, with the relationship between church and state, the role of religion in public life, the rights of religious dissent or nonconformity, and, in general, with the meaning of freedom from religion and for religion. In order to reflect the religious pluralism of the nation, the study group had to be composed by Protestant, Catholics, Catholic Jews, and non-doctrinaire secularists. None of the participants could be in a position which would seem to be committing their church or religious community. The only common ground for each of these individuals was American citizenship and the American constitutional principles. But while Murray believed in the role of natural law as a guidance, Niebuhr thought it would not be of help but a source of tension. The first public outcome of the work of the committee, and the only one actually concerning religion to which Murray was able to actively contribute, was the Seminar on Religion in a Free Society held in 1958. About 100 people gathered for about a week at the World Affairs Center in New York, with one only objective: argument. The aim of the CSDI was to let them meet, get to know one another, and go back to their communities, either religious or secular, and talk about those who were supposed to be the enemies, yet turned out to be persons to talk and disagree with. The main lectures became the essays collected in the book Religion in America. It was edited by John Courtney. And among the contributors were Murray, Niebuhr, Leo Pfeffer, Will Herberg, and Gustav Weigel. Murray, who spoke immediately after the introductory remarks of President Hutchins, presented there what later became the introduction to We Hold These Truths, the civilization of the pluralistic society. But we should read it within the context of the seminar on religion where the title was America's Four Conspiracies. Chair Fogarty mentioned them. It is an open call for a deeper understanding of the idea of a free society as a result of a common civil conversation, a breathing together, among the four American conspiracies: Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and secularist. Murray's argumentation is very simple. First, society is not a purely rational form of association. It is an expression of the will for justice, which is the ground for civic amity and peace. Second, in order to make that civil society, it should be formed by men locked together in argument, which is the highest exercise of reason. And there is quoting Thomas Gilby and St. Thomas Aquinas. Third, the climate of the city where such a political community lives is cool and dry, characterized by, I quote, a special kind of moral virtue, a thing of reason and intelligence, laboriously cultivated by the discipline of passion, prejudice, and narrow self-interest, end of quote. Therefore, it has nothing to do with the cleavage of a David to a Jonathan, quote, or with the charity that makes the solidarity of the church. So it was a very lively political community. Probably Murray's approach here was kind of like cynical, but it could see very well how people's position would be, starting positions would be. Four, the realms for argument within the city might be about public affairs, the affairs of the wider Commonwealth, and, most importantly, constitutional consensus. It is through constitutional consensus that people, quote, acquires its identity as a people, and the society is endowed with its vital form, its entelechy, its sense of purpose as a collectivity organized for action in history, end of quote. 5, since consensus is not a truth stated and held forever, but is experience illuminated by principles, the people must constantly engage in argument about constitutional consensus according to experience. 6, what is the contribution of the four conspiracies to the argument? It is largely differentiated due to the many different history. It is often wary and surely driven by confusion. Here it takes the example of natural law, contraceptives, double taxation, but also the role of Jews in American society or the antagonism between Catholics and Protestants. 7th and last point, does John Courtney Murray have a solution to the difficulties of the four conspiracies in breathing together as if they were only one, as a civil, just, free, peaceful society? No. It did not trust man's wisdom enough, nor he was a utopian. What John Courtney Murray offered to his contemporaries was a method. Limit the warfare, enlarge the dialogue, and take up argument. He knew it was not easy, quote, to project into the future of the Republic the nightmares, forget the ghettos, the know-nothings, and the Ku Klux Klan. But he firmly believed in the possibility of dissolving the structure of war that underlies the pluralistic society and erecting the more civilized structure of the dialogue. By doing so, quote, the pattern would not be that of ignorant armies clashing by night, but of informed men locked together in argument in the full light of a dialectical day. In conclusion, I believe that we can identify in Murray's approach to intellectual life a path which goes from spaces of dialogue to spaces of argument. And his participation in the works of the CCI-CA and CSDI are the manifestation of this approach. But we could probably find a similar pattern within his view on religious freedom as well. During the 10 years which elapsed between the establishment of the CCI-CA and CSDI, he realized that the only way possible for the academy, to be effective was to take part into the city, moving from an institutional, purely intellectual approach to a context-based approach. He was no longer looking for a compromise between converging groups' identities, but for a honest, conflictual argument among ever-defining social groups, bound together by the same propositions, but not by a common eschatology. Once more, he was a progressive among the conservatives. While throwing into crisis the nation under God, he found, quote, the variable constants of American history and kept alive the never-ending process of social and political reinvention of the American nation. Thank you.
We have a good amount of time for discussion. I would like to start out with just it's sort of an announcement to everybody, but also quizzing you two. You two have spent a lot of time in the Murray archives. I tried to get something out of the Murray archives a couple weeks ago, and I discovered that they're all off campus. And I heard from various and sundry people that they haven't been, nobody had tried to tap into them for 7 months before that. There are various number of reasons for that, but do you have anything, and I should have given you warning, that anything in there that you think deserve more study?
I'm thinking.
Okay.
I mean, my main thing has been to show that Murray is, number one, sometimes he misunderstood, and then he was misunderstood in turn. But you want to answer that, and let me think more.
Well, I've been working on this thing for a while recently, and I think that, well, you did a very good job with the published works, but there are so many documents, especially lectures and sermons, I think. Like the most famous are the Yale Lectures, of course, but there are many lectures and sermons that are, you know, in the archives, and access them is difficult, and so it's probably something that we should work on to like make it more accessible to scholars, encourage scholarship with archives as well.
We are taking over several tape things and try to preserve those. Particularly the one that was here at Georgetown University was, the cleaned up text was interesting and good. The one before the last session of the council. It was interesting and good, but the actual talk that he gave was very funny. And it's actually accessible on the web at the moment. So please, comments and questions.
Let me just throw in there, one of the things is there are 3 versions of this talk he gave at the Catholic University of America that led him to undertake silence. We don't know because it wasn't recorded. And I think they're all here in the archives, I think, if I recall, because I know I went through them. I got off on this, by the way, when I was teaching at Fordham, and I directed Don Palat's dissertation originally, because I had this fear that there really weren't going to be Jesuits coming along, so I had these diocesan priests, or at that time, Don was a mere seminarian in his order. He became the Bishop of Gallup, New Mexico. And I remember we came across this problem, the discrepancy. What did he say? Now, one of the interesting things is his source of information at the Vatican was Joseph Leiber, who was the professor of church history at the Gregorian University and quasi-confessor and private secretary to Pius XII. And incidentally, in 1940, he was also the go-between between the Pope and a group of dissident German generals to try to turn over information to the British and surrender. Anyway, you know, he had a very checkered career. Unfortunately, he destroyed his papers when the German army occupied the city of Rome. But I mean, he had this great influence on Murray, and yet I tried to find his papers a number of years ago and couldn't. So. But I mean, there's a discrepancy of which version did he give.
Good. So, do we have a mic floating around, or? Good. For comments? Good.
Dennis Bradley, formerly of the philosophy department here. I'm not an expert on Father Murray, but when I read him some years ago, I found myself wondering how deep was his knowledge of scholastic philosophical sources. It was evident that he referred easily to the natural law tradition, but that would have been something he could have easily gotten from what we would have called textbook scholastic secondary sources, as from which the Jesuits have produced a plethora. And I'm wondering often when I read him whether he had really studied Suarez very deeply or Aquinas very deeply, or he was basically just drawing on what he had learned as a Jesuit scholastic from secondary and tertiary sources. Does anyone have a sense of his depth of knowledge, say, of the original sources of scholastic philosophical tradition? It always struck me as a little thin in the way he presented things, and I wondered whether he was just drawing on secondary and tertiary sources.
I think we're all bailing out here. Does somebody want to respond to that?
No, I mean, it depends. Some of the sources, especially when when he goes through Leo's, the 13th position, it goes much more deeper than in We Hold These Truths into natural law and scholastics, and he would go touch also Bellarmine and other theologians. But yeah, the well-known texts, such We Hold These Truths is the most common. But again, We Hold These Truths needs to be read in the context where those texts, which are a collection, were presented. But there are many articles, and you can easily find them in the Georgetown library website. They go much more into deep analysis of natural law. I would suggest you to go to the Leo 13th series is a very good source, I think.
I would be interested.
I'm not a theologian.
Yeah, also in checking his class notes and so on in the archives.
You know, there's one other comment. When a certain person was being nominated for the Justice of the Supreme Court, a leading newspaper called the New York Times said, he has some obscure theory of something called natural law. The New York Times. I mean, you know, this is pretty bad. I mean, it's getting. And then that was responded to by a professor at the Harvard Law School who pointed out that really it has a major role to play in the development of common law. And that's the only thing I know. One of Thomas Aquinas' disciples was John of Paris, is that correct? Who then had a great influence at Oxford in terms of the development of the common law. Am I right on that? Pardon?
Murray was deeply engaged with that, with
Yeah.
John of Paris and with the whole, as you mentioned, Francisca, the articles on Leo the 13th go into the historical background of that material on natural law in considerable depth.
And actually the Yale Lectures were a way of like presenting it to a wider public, not specifically made by theologians.
And his teaching on the doctrine of the Trinity would carry him into Aquinas's theology, not only his philosophy of natural law, but his understanding of the Word of God and a whole series of other issues which carried him into Aquinas and Aquinas' antecedents in the patristic period in great depth. So, I mean, he didn't learn this just from reading a few manuals. Oh, yeah. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Now, not the entire tradition because no one does that, but certainly key points, I think, from what I could gather. You would agree, Francesca, about that? I think, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to continue this theme by asking anybody, panelists or anybody else. I know it's a little bit off the topic here, but since he was a Trinitarian theologian, and in the Middle Ages, which he did know very, very, very well, that there was this theory propounded by some of a Trinitarian model for the formation of society, whether he ever linked those two thoughts. I mean, from his teaching in Trinitarian theology and his, maybe not his statements of public theology in a book like We Hold These Truths, but in any other writings or sermons or lectures, if people are cognizant of that.
He had in 1940, he gave a series of 3 addresses which were built precisely around Trinitarian imagery of Father, Son, and Spirit. But
As a model in society?
as a model of society, yeah. He moved beyond that, and I think at least brought Trinitarian types of analysis into other arenas. But he initially started out, and it was a fairly straight Roman Catholic understanding.
Did he prescind from that view?
It got more confused and more interesting, actually. The first things that, as I haven't looked at them in a long time, but the first time I read them, it was almost cookie cutter sort of thing. I wasn't so sure where John Courtney Murray was in those discussions, but he did move beyond that.
Thank you, Jerry, for reminding us that Cardinal Spellman and Archbishop Ignacy did not really get along, and that the papal delegate, even during the council, was still sending monitums to clergy for innovations in liturgy. So the reason religious liberty was the 5th chapter of De Ecumenismo was because from the start, John wanted the council to be ecumenical and outreach to other Christians longing for that unity. And in a secret meeting in 1960 with Vissertuft of the World Council of Churches, the General Secretary advised the Cardinal, no one's going to believe you in ecumenism unless you say something about religious liberty. And Spellman then brought John Courtney Murray to the second session as his personal, it must have really bothered Cicognani to give him that permission to be a peritus. But when was the classic standoff between Pavon and Murray in the drafting on religious liberty? Pavon was the drafter of Pacem in Terris. Stransky always told me that Pope John said to Pavon, I want a document that both Khrushchev and Kennedy will read. And so apparently he and Murray had a standoff in the early stages of the drafting. Is that true?
That I didn't know, frankly, because I know one of the things was de Smet wanted to take a whole different approach. He wanted to get to the notion of the dignity of the human person as opposed to religious liberty as a relationship between church and state. And therefore, but he loyally read the draft, I thought, done jointly by Murray and Pavon. Yeah.
Well, as far as I know, Pavon would go from the hospital to the Vatican to talk with Murray about the text. But it's like, yeah.
Yeah, that was my impression too. Didn't he speak here at some point, Pavon?
He
Yeah.
gave
Yeah.
a lecture under the sponsorship of the Woodstock Theological Center, which was published in a
Yeah.
small book commemorating Dignitatis Humanae.
Yeah.
And it went into the accounts of how Murray and he worked together on the drafting of the document. So Pavon and Murray, in my understanding, were very close to each other, not adversarial.
I wanted to follow up on Francesca's delineation of the consensus, that it seems to me there's a conflict in Murray's thought and writings between the consensus, the public consensus being, on the one hand, as you described, creeds at war intelligently. That is, in a sense, almost the process of argumentation itself is the foundation for the consensus. And at other times, he talked about the consensus as being a substantive set of truths, namely natural law truths, and about democracy and human rights in substance. So one was process, one was substance. How do you find those reconciled? Because years ago I went and listened to those tapes out in Santa Barbara,
Yeah.
which are very interesting. That's something that might be preserved in the Woodstock stuff, because it's very helpful stuff. But how would you reconcile those
Yeah,
two?
it was the first time I heard Murray's voice and was quite impressed because you always study on the text and then you get the voice and it's like shocking. I think it was so he moved from natural law and consensus on substance to the process. I think it was I wouldn't say the reconciling way. I think there are two steps of his intellectual story. I mean, he would find that there is a core of truths, but then he realized that it was not possible that everybody would agree on the same truths. So he preferred to offer the process, so how to get to renew those truths depending on experience. So it was like, I think it was a process. That's what I meant by saying from a space for dialogue to a space of argument. I think he realized it was not possible that Catholic, Protestant, Jews, and secularists would agree on the real same truths. And so he thought the method would be more helpful.
I have a question, friends. When the Catholic Committee, why did it, I was a member of it. I think you were too, Brian, weren't you? Yeah. I mean, the trouble was there was no money.
Yeah,
if you weren't giving a paper, your university's not going to pay for you. But the last meeting I remember we had was at Holy Cross, and there's a guy at the table who was interested in what I was doing, and he got up and gave a talk. He said, when I got the Nobel Prize for Medicine, that's the kind of people who were in it, and then it suddenly ended.
Yeah, well, Patrick Hayes worked only for the, I think it was 15 years, first 15 years, which were the most intense, I think. But there's no complete history about the Catholic. You mean the Catholic Commission on Culture? Yeah.
See, we had a meeting, they started regional meetings, and we had one at Catholic U, and they invited somebody from the Supreme Court, which was a mistake because it didn't work. And that was sort of an effort to have more local meetings, and then and there's nothing now that was the equivalent.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Just one comment on the process versus substance sort of thing. I think besides there being a lack of consensus, let's say, in society, Murray was also interested in the generation of new truths, you know, that people were trying to cut out into a future that they couldn't possibly conceive from their sources. And therefore, that process demanded some virtues that under the substantial view of public meaning are insufficient to handle. But,
I just want to add something about the commissions at that time. Catholic U has very good archives for the Commission on American Citizenship. That commission was part of this idea of like making Catholics good Americans and make them part of the whole society. Just like was very lively period.
I'm Amy Olin. I'm teaching seminars in law and religion at the law school here. Mm-hmm. And again, on this question of process and substance, both of you in your remarks indicated kind of either a concern or a disappointment that there's not more Murray scholarship. And so I was just curious what you would see as paths for encouraging engagement with Murray now perhaps in light of the concerns that we have culturally now, and maybe if this process substance question might be a path in for our concerns in the culture today.
Well, I hope so. I think there are many, as an historian, there are many sources that still have to be, disseminated. The Center for the Study of the Democratic Institution is one of those. But the archives, they're not, people do not use them enough. So I think that from my point of view, we would need to encourage more historical research on Murray first. And I think that would be helpful to understand today's United States. But it's, it's always a problem of like, where does it bring to, and do you produce policy-driven outcomes or not? And so it's quite difficult for departments to fund also this kind of research.
Can I pick up one thing? You mentioned Monsignor Ellis's essay of 1953. And he was interviewed again in 1983. Then we had a panel on him for the 50th anniversary. And I was on the panel. And I was appalled because what he said in 1953 was more true in 2003. The panel proved that they were anti-intellectual. I mean, just the whole thing is, his thinking people should learn foreign languages, and John wasn't the best one in foreign languages. But nevertheless, he pushed this, and the life of the mind, and it was just, it was all just, they made fun of it. And I thought, okay, that's a problem. It's not just a Catholic problem. Well, I retired from UVA back in the spring. But one of the things was our history department dropped a foreign language requirement for American historians, meaning they can't read any book reviews in foreign languages. I thought that, that was narrowing down and becoming very, very insular. But
And if you study church issues, you should at least know Italian, Latin, and what makes you access the documents.
Okay. Good. One last thing that I'd love to see discussed is the difference in tone of the societies that you both described. There's a strain in the American sort of thing to push somewhat. Then that strain isn't in the Roman Catholic. But anyway, so let us thank our speakers and the great research that they have brought to us today. And again, this is a takeoff point.